Stupid daylight savings time, and it's different between the U.S. and Europe, and blah blah blah.
All right. Okay.
Hooray!
We are, in theory, live. Because last
Why-
week I kind of futzed about while I was saying I think we're live, and the alert's up, and then when I watched it back afterwards, there was all of us futzing about on the recording. So I think we're actually live, even though there's no one watching us yet. There is one user concurrently
19.
right now.
I see 19.
Oh, well, this.
Yeah.
Oh, I see 19 seconds. You sure? Oh, okay. I see one.
So I see 26. This is like Bitcoin pricing.
So every time you're saying that, it's literally how many seconds we've been live. Do you see 33 right now?
I see 29.
Okay. The last two that you said, it matched up exactly with how long we'd been on the stream for. So it's just interesting. If I let me have a look, if I go and look at what you're looking at the public one, I guess.
Yes.
So professional. I'm looking at the monitor studio. No, you're right. It says 42. Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? This is delayed for some reason. Well, hello, everybody. We are here this week. It is still just John and I. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you're expecting more. Hanselman is still on holiday, right?
Yes, I think he's flying back today.
Okay, so I think he's back in the office in like 3 or 4 days. So next week, if he's not too jet lagged and not too, tired from declaring email bankruptcy, he might be on the show and we can talk to him again.
And I will be in Bulgaria at DevReach. So.
Oh, you won't be here.
Yeah.
So it'll just be Scott and me next week.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Otherwise, all is well. So we've had some stuff happen in the last week. We had a good show last week. I think we had a good discussion. And then we changed some stuff. We folks complained about my audio last week going up and down. And I did watch the show afterwards, and I agree the audio was a little annoying. I got quiet at times. We think, well, okay, we don't know if we've solved it. We changed some stuff, and then we'll see if we solved it. We found a whole bunch of settings in Windows that were trying to do magic, and so we just went and turned it all off. And we'll see if that makes any difference. And so hopefully folks will tell us that the audio is amazing now, and we've finally got it solved after, doing 157 shows or whatever it is.
Yep.
But we had a different blog post. We had a new blog post yesterday about .NET Standard 2.1, announcing .NET Standard 2.1 and some details around that. Obviously, we spoke about last week's post. Today, I'll chat a little bit about an early discussion about the features that we have planned for ASP.NET Core 3. And we might have a little chat about a tweet I put out during the week regarding some potential proposed modifications to this show, or additions, I should say, to this show. Because we don't really plan on removing anything, but we're looking at maybe opening it up to more content. Sebastian is saying the audio is the best it has ever been right now.
That's quite exciting.
And Sebastian is a very critical sort of individual, so I am taking that with extra kudos. So Sebastian says it's good. It must be amazing.
That is good.
All right. So John, do you love the community?
I do love the community.
Okay.
Let me prove it to you.
John loves
Community.
community.
One. There it is, sharing.
Okay.
All right.
I see your face.
So,
Don't see
yeah,
it.
great.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. See your desk. Nice.
Excellent. So first of all, starting with another from Shahed, he's been doing this series. He's told me he's running through the end of the year with these at least, so a lot of good stuff. Here he's talking about web app secrets in ASP.NET Core. This is an important thing. It's very, if you're used to throwing stuff in web.config, you can definitely make some mistakes with this. So it's important to understand like the different places you can put your secrets. Don't just throw all your stuff in your connection strings. So understanding user secrets and secret manager is important. And that whole flow, I always walk people through this. And too, Damien, we do this during the workshops where we say, here's where you put your secrets when you're developing locally.
Right.
And, use your user secrets and then, promote those up to environment variables and, as you deploy.
Right. Or even something more protected like Key Vault or
exactly.
Using the Docker container secret system or something like that. Yeah.
So really good stuff.
Nice.
And nice to see that walkthrough. Cool. Here's one from Andrew. So last week we're looking at the configure, using configure for loading in options, strongly typed options. And here he talks through an instance where if you are developing something that can read in strongly typed options and you need to enforce something, then you need to know about this post configure event. And it's just good to know about in general. So here he walks through. So, the idea here is as a library author, and he has an example where he's got a WhatsApp service. And the general idea here is he has a rule where if you are going to make one setting, then you must also make another setting.
Right.
So if you're going to set default hosted URL, then you must be in the default hosted region.
Right.
And the exact specifics here aren't important. It's just if one, then the other, right?
Right. So what's interesting about this is that this API he's using was introduced in 2.1. This is the post-configure step, and we use this inside some of our own subsystems like Identity to ensure that because we have fairly complex sets of options because they're flexible, and that if you set one option, like you said, you may have to set another one, or it may conflict with a different one, so you can only set that they're mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. But what people really wanted was an idea of options validation, right, as a first-class feature. So guess what we did in 2.2? We added options validation. I don't think we've done a demo of it yet. I don't even think we've done a blog post of it. But there's a great idea for maybe next week's show or the week after that. We could get, maybe I can convince Hal, who's the developer of this, to come on and talk about options validation. So now in 2.2, rather than having to do this, which is a custom post-configure method provider, you'll be able to instead register, like your options type, you can actually just stick data annotation attributes on them, and we'll find those and validate them, assuming the app is wired up that way. Or you can register custom delegates that will validate your options as well. It's all built on top of the same stuff. Ultimately, it all boils down to like we register a delegate that runs on this event that you're showing here. But it's going to be much easier to be first-class validated. You can say this is required, and this is like whatever validation attribute you want to use on your options. So.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, always nice to be able to delete some code.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here he's showing, in this case, he's got, this kind of not robust thing where if you set things in the wrong order or whatever, it might not work. And then he shows using this post configure options in his library. Right. So, yep.
Nice.
So great. And this was a great opportunity for me to learn about a feature I didn't know in 2.2.
That's awesome.
Cool. Great. Here's a walkthrough from Sarah Thalal. Hopefully I said that right. And this is on building a single page app with Azure Database using Blazor and MariaDB. So MariaDB is built by the developers of MySQL, or after as a replacement for MySQL. And so here he walks through. I'm interested in this as I'm seeing people building out these kind of full examples, building out something that's more complex. So decent amount of code here. He's, building out this entire back end, and let me roll way down here. So it's editing employees and stuff. So this is neat. I'm looking forward to seeing people build out even more. Like it'd be fun to see someone build out. Steve built that one with the flight finder.
Right.
It'd be neat to see that actually like database backed or something.
Yeah.
So, this is just kind of neat. This is Ben Adams blogged about this, or actually just tweeted. But this is this is backed by ASP.NET Core, and he blogged about how it's 4K quality. It's it's all. So this is an example of he said, "Is this a single page app?" And I thought that was kind of neat. So this is the Illyriad Games. It's a game, and it's all SignalArt and ASP.NET Core and super high performance, and you can click around and have fun.
Nice.
Yeah, neat stuff. Okay, continuous integration from Tiago. Here it's a relatively quick walkthrough on using Azure pipelines with ASP.NET Core. So this is something where if you're kind of generally aware that it's out there, this is, I recommend go through and do this. You can do this in a period of a few minutes here. So creating a project and setting it up, and setting this up so you have a build going against, including GitHub as your backend, and running builds as your code is checked in.
Cool.
So, yep. All right, two neat ones from Visual Studio Magazine on Blazor. One is on working with events and looking at, building up from the simple events where, you have like an on-click and there's no nothing to pass or configure with it. Then building up to things like event data. And so here he has a key was pressed, and which exact key was pressed. So the different kind of ways that you can pass things in. The syntax is a little bit it's fine, but it's not like intuitively obvious immediately. So I think this is a nice kind of write up here talking about that, and then kind of ending up with user-defined events.
Cool.
So that's cool. Here's another neat one from Pete Vogel, and here he's talking about using adding Blazor to an existing HTML and JavaScript page. So it's very easy to do file, new project, Blazor, and you've got something all pre-wired up. But another, maybe more real-world example, or a nice example is a case where you've got an existing site and you'd like to take advantage of Blazor there. So here he talks about integrating that in. So you've got the required includes, and he talks about here the using JS runtime invoke async to actually initialize the page.
Fancy.
So yeah, relatively quick post, but good to know about. All right, Scott Allen here. He's previously posted 7 tips for troubleshooting ASP.NET Core startup errors, and here was an interesting one he ran into where application wasn't starting up on Azure App Service. Sorry, brain just went away. On Azure App Service, and so here the thing that he actually ran into was debugging using the Kudu console, and it would start in some circumstances, but not in others. And what he found out was he actually had this hosting startup assemblies, and there's a conflict between the different possible ways that they're loaded. So you can have Azure App Insights loaded either via the extension, or if it's configured via Visual Studio, there can be a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a pretty specific case where he had to uninstall one or the other, but also good to know that you can do this where you can go over to Kudu console and just run, from the command line and see what happens in production there.
Cool.
All right. So Johnny here has a nice post. I'm calling this out specifically because this is a 48-minute video where he walks through everything, and then a long blog post to go with it. So sometimes people will post either a video or a blog post, and here we've got both. So this is a review, a pretty in-depth review or deep dive into dependency injection. Building. I'm not going to go through it in more depth. This is 48 minutes of video or a long blog post ahead of you if you're interested. Okay, faster front ends in ASP.NET Core from Dustin. So here he's talking about some of the front end things like bundling, minification, starting with measuring. How do you actually measure? And he talks about Mini Profiler and then goes into Fiddler. And then, digging into what your options are for things like bundling, minification. And you do have several, right? There's like Webpack, there's bundler minifier, there's compression, etc. So there's a lot of kind of options here.
Right.
I've done some things like people have tweeted to me and asked about this, or I've written things up. It seems like this is something where it's a little bit of a science project, and some of the docs we might need to update on that because they're back. A lot of them are still kind of focused on grunt only or gulp only.
I see. As opposed to.
Well, like for instance, there are some other. There's Webpack.
I thought the docs actually talked about bundler minifier, Webpack, and gulp. Maybe I'm wrong.
They do, but some of them were not quite as.
Okay.
I had to explain a bit. Like the Webpack itself, I don't think was part of the thing. Like for instance, Less and Sass, they're okay, but they're not. I don't know. That's a side thing, I guess. But that's something that struck me, and part of why I was happy to see this blog post.
Okay, cool. It's something that we should go and address.
Yep. All right. So Barry Doran's. I'm linking to this page because I think it's easier to find a little bit. But this is on the GitHub ASP.NET announcements repo. And here he's got a survey asking for your experience using identity UI and customization.
Yes.
So good stuff.
Where is that? Can we just stick on that for a sec so folks know where that is? Sorry?
Yeah.
That was.
Well, so I think this is easiest to get to here. This is
It's
in
on the
announcement.
announcements repo? Okay, good.
Yep.
I need to tweet that actually. Excellent.
Yep, and Barry did earlier too. And we retweeted it from the ASP.NET and from the .NET things too on Twitter. So if you're following any of those, you'll see it. And the last one, you mentioned this earlier, but ASP.NET or .NET Standard 2.1. So, a nice post here on what's in there. Yay, span of T, some other things, reflection emit. I love SIMD so much. I just love watching all the posts and PRs and stuff that go in as we continue to take more advantage of that. So that's neat.
Oh, cool.
And then talking about platform support. And then this is really, I think, important is this whole governance model. So Imo and I talked about this and we worked on, getting this set up. This is something that we're doing very much with the .NET Foundation. So it's not, there's a whole governance model and a review board and everything. So this is really the standard is something that's done in the open, something that you can get involved with and review. So I think this is really cool how we're doing this. And if you're interested in .NET Standard in general, something to get deeper involved with.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all my stuff.
Nice.
So, all right, I need to switch back over there.
Yes,
okay, cool.
you do. All right. Well, I haven't got all the time today. I have to leave today. It's my son's final for go-karting tonight for the year, so I have to leave early to go and pick him up and take him to that. So I wanted to start early today so we could have a little bit of a chat about 3.0 features, so actual feature level stuff coming in 3.0. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a couple of things here that I wanted to show folks. So let's go ahead and do that. So it looks like that's up on the screen, should be cool. Let's start off with this spreadsheet. So this is a spreadsheet that we use internally to help us think about how we're assigning our human resources, our developers, right? Our actual engineers who do all the work on ASP.NET Core. And so, technically it's ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. You'll see that here, Entity Framework, because they all report up through the same developer manager or engineering manager. And so this is basically how do we allocate all the people within that team, all that org, across all the feature areas that we care about or we're focusing on this release. And then what's interesting is we also compare that back to what we had done for the previous release so that we have a bit of a delta. So we can see roughly, we've either increasing investment here in terms of the folks we have involved or decreasing the investment here. Now, just so if there are people out there who are upset that I'm treating developers like numbers, trust me, there is personal details in this spreadsheet which I've hidden. So we don't just treat however many developers we have as just individual people. It's just they're cattle and I can just put 4 here and put 6 there. We all know it doesn't work that way. We have different people with different talents and different interests, and we take that into consideration when we do this as well, like any good development team would, I would argue. But I've hidden all their names because you don't need to know those. And so what we do have here though is the overall assignment of how many developer bodies basically have we assigned to each area, and then how is that different? What's the change from the previous release being 2.2, that's line 29 here, and then how focused is that crew? So the crew is the verticals here. Each column here represents an area, a bunch of features like SignalArt or MVC and Endpoint Routing or Razor. And then the last line here is, if we look at the entire team, all end developers, how focused how much of the team are we focusing on a particular area? Okay, so that's kind of an interesting place to start. So if we look at EF and EF6, so Entity Framework Core obviously will be part of EF, part of .NET Core 3. We'll have an Entity Framework Core 3, and there's features coming for that. But there's also Entity Framework 6, which we have already announced is going to be ported to work on .NET Core to help customers who really need the capabilities of Entity Framework 6, which simply won't come over because of the way Entity Framework Core is addressing slightly different problems. So you can see that of the entire engineering team, 21% of our engineers is focused on Entity Framework. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea, just a little bit more than a fifth of the entire team is focused on Entity Framework. The next biggest investment in this release is Razor, and so we saw a Blazor post there. We've talked a lot about Blazor, how it's an experiment, it's not real. But then we made the announcement that we're going to take the component model from Blazor and we're going to pull that into Razor on the server, what's called server-side Blazor today, with the promise that we'll continue to experiment with the client-side WebAssembly piece, eventually with the view that you'll be able to build Razor component apps in ASP.NET Core 3, and then in the future, hopefully very simply move those to run the client. And so we have a large investment in Razor in 3.0, and that is a combination of the actual Razor compiler, the parser and the compiler, the build chain, the component model, so all the APIs that you use, all the stuff that you see in Blazor today, like how do I implement types and all that type of stuff. What's the replacement for tag helpers? How does forms validation work? All the things that you could think about when I'm building UIs. It's also the tooling. So like, how does Razor and Razor components show up in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code? That's all included inside this as well.
Two quick things coming in here. One is a question of how many engineers we have total.
Oh, well, you noticed I didn't actually say that.
Yeah,
I'm happy to say it.
Well, actually,
so you can look at this and count it up. It's actually on this screen.
26
it's
is
26.
what I see over in V.
Yeah, so it's 26. So
and then the other one, somebody I think misread this because Tobias says only 0.8% for Blazor, but that's actually 0.8 persons, right?
Yeah. So no, it's 0.8% of the entire team. That is keeping, so from this team doesn't own WebAssembly. This team doesn't own the mono runtime. This team owns the Blazor framework, and it has been an experiment. To date, we've only had one engineer full-time on Blazor, that's been Steve, running it as an experiment. Most of his focus...
But it's not 0.8%. It's
0.2 people out of 26.
Okay.
So I think that's right. And so because this 20%, or this 0.2 people, 20% of a developer, is how do we ensure that the Blazor experiment continues during the 3.0 timeframe? Most of the work is going into the stuff we're going to ship in 3.0, and then there's a little bit of work to make sure that you can continue to do new Blazor releases as the mono team develops new WebAssembly bits, that we repackage the templates, we ship those out, so there'll be a Blazor 0.7.0, a Blazor 0.8.0, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not shipping the Blazor on top of WASM in 3.0, right? So it doesn't need as many people on it as we had before. And obviously there could be mistakes in the spreadsheet as well. So if you think they are, point out. But I think that one's correct. Blazor was the next, Razor, in covering all the stuff I talked about. I think the next highest investment we have is SignalArt. So SignalArt is 10% of the team, which is about 2.5 people. That's a reduction. We had more. We had about 3 people all up full-time in the previous release because we built SignalArt Core in 2.1 and then we added clients in 2.2. This time around, this is mostly adding clients, and I'll talk a little bit about the features for each of these in a moment, and some work with the Azure SignalArt service and just improving some stuff there. So there's that. And then I think the next one after that was servers, if I recall. So we own Kestrel, we own the ANCM, ASP.NET Core module. It's a big reduction in investment this time. So in 2.2, the big work we did here was ANCM in proc. So the ability to host ASP.NET Core inside IIS in process with IIS. That was a lot of work. It literally took more than 3 engineers to get that put together through the entirety of 2.2. Now that that's done, we'll move into, we have to finish HTTP2 in Kestrel in 3.0, and obviously we just have to maintain Kestrel and maintain the ANCM work. There'll be a bug tail, no doubt, and we'll have to do some work there. So that's obviously why we have people there. And then there's a bit of a tail after that. So there's some new things here which are interesting, but it's probably less interesting to keep looking at numbers and more interesting to go off to a different view and actually look at people. This one is interesting. So there's an overhead, obviously, just keeping things building. So we have a couple of people whose job is just to keep the stuff building, integrating with the bigger build, make sure our stuff gets inserted into the .NET Core installers, gets inserted into Visual Studio, all that sort of stuff. So that's a cost. And then we have some folks who are taking some leave as well. So we have to account for that when we do our resource management as well. So that takes up a bit of time, this release as well. So anyway, I thought this was an interesting view to show folks in terms of how we think about where we're investing, in this case, 26 developers across everything that we consider EF and sort of ASP.NET Core. If we go actually and look at a list of things instead, so in terms of stuff, if we look at sort of web apps, so I think most people already know the big things here. We'll support Razor C#, C# 8 inside Razor, because that's the next version of the language. We often have to do stuff as they introduce syntax to support that inside Razor. The big thing, obviously, is Razor components, plus the tooling work, including VS Code, which we released in the latest version of the OmniSharp or C# extension. I hope folks have tried that out. We finally have Razor support in VS Code, which is fantastic. The last other thing that's worth calling out is we plan to move the SPA templates. So this is the Angular, React, and Redux templates that we have in the SDK today. We plan to take them out of the SDK and make them simply available as NuGet packages. And the reason for that is that we've just found that the SPA frameworks themselves are moving at a pace that is just too out of step with our SDK. And so we have these periods where a new version of Angular comes out, which actually just happened, and our templates don't have that version of Angular. And it's not trivial sometimes to move our template to that version of Angular for a customer. We would love to be able to react to that much quicker, and that is difficult today when it's inside the SDK, because we kind of have to wait for the SDK's ship cycle. And so we plan to take those out of the SDK, make them separately installable. We still think, I think we still plan to include them in the Visual Studio experience by default, because we have extra capabilities in there. You can download things on the fly and all that type of stuff. But for the command line, it would just be moved out of the SDK. So the end result to customers isn't any different. We're still going to do them and all that type of stuff. It just frees us up to do stuff hopefully a little more flexibly. For the generic host, this is something we introduced in 2.1. It's basically take the goodness of web host, where you boot up your application, you configure the server, you configure the DI container, you configure logging, you configure configuration, and then you can say go from your program CS in the console app, and then make that available for other app types, app types that don't have a web server, for example, which will become a little interesting when we get to line 8. And so we actually intend for generic host to basically replace web hosts. So everywhere today where you see web host in the templates, the current plan is web host will still be in 3.0. It might be marked obsolete with the intention that we would remove it in the next major release in 4.0, and then it would be a fairly straightforward process to move the few lines of code that you have in program main from the web host start to the generic host start. The advantage is then you can use that same host entry point, not just to host web apps, but to have apps that are hybrid. So for example, you could have SignalArt running over HTTP in the web part of your app, but then also listening over TCP, but on top of the same host and on top of the same Kestrel server. You could also have the same host hosting the Azure Web Jobs SDK, which is the next section, responding to Azure Storage Triggers or a RabbitMQ message bus event, all inside not only the same app, but running inside the same host, which means they share logging, they share configuration, they share a DI container. Mm-hmm. So that is the generic
and
host.
Data cache, whatever.
Right? Yeah, exactly, because it's DI, everything you have in DI, like caching or whatever else, auth, gets shared across everything. And so that work is happening as part of 3.0 as well, and it's likely that we would end up making that the default in all of our templates. So event-driven apps, which I talked about. Today, when you're building sort of cloud-native applications or really any type of apps, often you won't only have a web app, you'll have these other apps that say either Windows services or daemon-driven inside Linux, or they just run as batch jobs that you fire up every now and then, and they like check a database and see if any events need to be processed, or listen to a storage trigger from your storage server or storage service, or they subscribe to a RabbitMQ message thing or service bus, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're event-driven. They're not request-driven. They're not I start a server and I wait for requests. They're I start up and then I wait for something to happen, either a timer interval or something triggering off a webhook or something like that, right? So that app model, we want to share as much as we can with all the goodness that we have with ASP.NET Core. So again, we want the same host type, we want the same logging, we want the same configuration, we want the same DI. Well, it turns out that's already been built. It was the Azure Web Jobs SDK, and that's what underpins Azure Functions. And Azure Functions v2 is built on .NET Core and is built on generic host. So they already do all this stuff. You can just download the Azure Web Jobs SDK and run it anywhere. Now, we want our stuff to be cloud agnostic. We want you to be able to run these things on premises. We want you to be able to run them on Google and Amazon or whatever you want to run this stuff, right? It's just .NET. So don't be fooled by the fact it's called the Azure Web Jobs SDK. It's just .NET, and then it has a bunch of triggers that you can pull in via packages to say, hey, yeah, this trigger will allow me to bind this class, a bit like an MVC controller, so that this method runs when an Azure blob storage file is changed, right? There's no reason you can't write those triggers for any storage system, for example, or for any message bus system. So that's our plan, is that we want to incorporate these types of apps into the overall sort of .NET Core, ASP.NET Core app model using all the same primitives. We want templates for them in the SDK and Visual Studio and all that type of stuff. So we're going to do some work with the Azure Web Jobs SDK team. It's very early days yet. We're still figuring out how this is going to work, but this will happen during the 3.0 timeline.
So Sebastian asked me to ask you to talk about tiered compilation. The users should turn it on. Oh, sorry if that's interrupting.
Not at all. So yeah, so tier compilation, as an aside, we previewed in 2.1. You could turn it on in your 2.1 apps, and it was specifically marked as preview. So we wanted people to try it, give us feedback, but it wasn't supported for production. We've had it on by default in 2.2 in the runtime, but it won't be on, in the previews, I should say. It won't be on by default in the RTM, okay, in 2.2. But if you turn it on in 2.2, it's supported. So, and it's very beneficial for most people to turn on tier compilation. It generally has a good improvement on startup time, but more so it has a really big improvement on what we call steady state performance, or just throughput. And so we want folks to really try that out in 2.2. And then the plan in 3.0 is just to have it on by default. So the more people who turn it on in 2.2 and give us feedback to make sure now that it's supported that we haven't introduced any problems, we'll feel more confident in turning it on by default in the next major version. So hear more about, there has been a blog post about tier compilation. We'll do another one after 2.2 is out to really encourage folks to turn it on and try it out. So let's go back to my screen. API client gen. So we talked about this as part of 2.2. This work hasn't been finished as part of 2.2. What we currently hope is that this will probably ship as an OOB, or add a band as we call it. So a package that you can install into your project after 2.2, sometime in the months following 2.2. And this will introduce a new MS Build item type called service reference, which works a little similarly, like in the old days, still today for a lot of folks. You add service reference in Visual Studio via a UI, it connects to WSDL and a WCF endpoint, generates you a bunch of code, puts that code into your project, and then that code is in your project, and now you've got a client that talks to your service. We wanted to kind of democratize that experience and make it more integrated with the project build, and not have it tied to a specific endpoint technology, have it more tied to just Open API in general, or Swagger in general, but then you can configure code generators. So we've worked with the author of the NSwag open source library, which includes a code generation piece as well as the Swagger endpoint generation piece. And we're also going to work with the Azure Auto-REST team so that you can integrate service reference with either one of those two things, or you can build your own code generator or plug in your own favorite code generator. So that when you say, hey, I've got this project, I have a service reference from this project to this Swagger document, or to this Swagger, or to this project that contains a Swagger endpoint, then as part of the build, or through a gesture, you can get code emitted in the client project. And we'll start out with C# code, but the intent is that this would support any client type. So you'd be able to have TypeScript clients being generated, or Java clients, or whatever it might be, depending on, obviously anything that uses MS Build, because this is an MS Build feature, so usually it's going to be MS Build projects. But the idea obviously is just to make it better for end-to-end API authoring and consumption. So that's going on. Endpoint routing, which we is shipping in 2.2 behind the scenes in MVC. So MVC gets all the performance benefits of endpoint routing. In 3.0, in fact, hopefully in the first preview of 3.0, endpoint routing will be available for all, and it will be updated in the templates. And so rather than MVC just having its own endpoint routing, we'll enable endpoint routing in new projects by default because it'll be in the template. And it basically gives you a new overlay on top of a middleware that makes routing global. So routing is now a global concern. Any middleware can set the endpoint at any point during the lifetime of the request. It's a little similar to how you used to have modules and handlers, and a module could set the handler at the end of the request. But basically it's designed for things that are terminal. So if you have any middleware today that usually ends up being terminal, that means when it matches, it then runs and then shortcuts the pipeline, like MVC does or SignalArt. Those are candidates to become endpoint route handlers in the new world. And you get a whole bunch of benefits from doing that. It's much faster. You can attach metadata to routes or to requests as they go through the middleware pipeline, which means that things like authorization now become a global concern. Today, authorization is implemented multiple times. It's implemented in MVC, it's implemented in SignalArt, we don't have authorization for static files. If you have your own framework like Nancy or some other thing, then you don't have any authorization. We might share the attributes today, but the actual authorization implementation is not in the pipeline. That will be different in 3.0. There'll be an authorization middleware, and it will work with endpoint routing to be able to look at the metadata on the current request, determine if the endpoint needs authorization, and if it does, it'll be able to perform that for you. Very similar to how authentication works today. HTTP 2 is basically finishing HTTP 2. We have HTTP 2 in 2.2. It's not turned on by default because it's not edge ready. In 3.0, we expect to get HTTP 2 to the point that it can be on by default and edge ready so that you can have it publicly facing the internet.
And that edge ready is like just the testing and setting the defaults so that it's like...
It's hardening. It's basically bake time, right? It's basically all the stuff about, it's bake time. So HTTP 1.1 obviously has been in Kestrel longer. We put a lot of effort into making sure we added limits and we tested those limits and we had third parties look at those limits. Like we did all the things that you do. But with HTTP 2, this is the first release that we've had HTTP 2 and it's a minor release, so we haven't had as much time, so it's just not ready to turn on by default. For SignalArt, couple things. We're looking at a feature called Client Hubs, which is basic. It's a bad name. It's really typed hubs. So the ability to have the same type of type safety on the server, but have that in .NET clients. So that you can say, when you build your server-side hub, you can attach an interface to it that says, oh, when I call client methods, this is the type contract I have associated with those client methods.
Is there stuff going on with SignalArt that's different feature-wise for like in support of Blazor, or that works differently because of Blazor?
No, not really today. Today, the server-side Blazor stuff are what's currently being called Razor circuits or component circuits, which is where you have something running, sort of rendered in the browser, but it's actually running on the server, which is the server-side Blazor model. That uses SignalArt today. Whether it continues to use the SignalArt layout or whether it goes lower to the thing that underpins SignalArt, called Bedrock, is still to be determined. Okay, we don't really know yet. It's more of an implementation detail. Then there is a future idea, which is what if we could somehow have a higher level concept where Blazor and SignalArt work together. So if you have a component, which is a Razor component, that needs real-time functionality, could we give you a primitive for that? That makes it easy, so you don't have to wire it up. And maybe that's what you're thinking about. So that won't be in 3.0, but that's kind of an idea that we had further on that would be kind of cool. Cool. C++ client, we have a bunch of customers who are interested in using SignalArt in games. And so C++ is interesting, or IoT. C++ is interesting there, so we want to do a C++ client. We also have a Swift client that was written by a former team member who now doesn't work for us but is maintained in the community. It might be interesting. We've had some folks ask for that as well. And so we'll see how much time we have and all the rest of it, but I think that's kind of the order of things that we're looking at. There's a couple of little other things in SignalArt as well that aren't really worth calling out. GRPC, this is an interesting one. So folks might know what GRPC is already. It's a Google-based RPC protocol that is implemented on top of HTTP 2 and protobuf. And it's basically designed for tightly coupled services where you need incredibly high performance and you want strong contracts between the client and the server. For folks who have used WCF with the net TCP binding, it might sound familiar. It's a very similar problem space. You've got two services, you own both sides, you've got a service and a client, and you want there to be a typed interface with message exchange between them, which looks like RPC. I just call a method and I get a response back, and I want that to be as fast as possible. That's what gRPC is designed to do. We see it increasingly being used in microservices architectures where you have services calling other services. And inside Microsoft, some people might have heard of Bond, which was a binary serialization format built by the Bing team. My understanding is they're now exploring moving to gRPC instead as it becomes more and more prevalent. And so we want to help Google make the .NET gRPC implementation as good as it can be. All right, so they have one today. We think it could be a lot better. We think it could integrate probably more naturally with the way .NET projects work in .NET Core. And so we are going to try and dedicate some resources to help do that. So we'll work with them. We're not going to build our own thing. We're going to help them build their thing and make it as good as it can be. So that's something that we're interested in doing. And that hopefully will go all the way to, one day you can file new in Visual Studio and there'll be a gRPC project template in there by default as part of our workload offering. And then you can build a gRPC-based application and it feels like .NET Core, but you get all the great benefits of gRPC.
Cool.
Distributed tracing, there's some standards efforts going on with the W3 distributed tracing effort. There's a bunch of different teams in Microsoft who are working with Google and some other vendors and the standards boards about this. So we hope to get that integrated into .NET so that when you're using .NET, again, highly distributed applications, typically microservices, that call out to other things, that we all kind of adhere to the standard sets of headers that are used to pass correlation IDs and bags of data and all that type of stuff. So that's work. That's part of the 3.0 work. So that helps folks who want to get the benefits of a standardized distributed tracing sort of story. Templates I'll talk about first quickly. So some template stuff. We just did Bootstrap 4 in 2.2. For 3.0, we're going to take this opportunity to have a bigger look at our template story. I think there's a few things we'd love to be able to do in 3.0. Now that we're adding new workloads like WinForms and WPF, it's a good chance for us to look at the template experience in Visual Studio, for example, and say, hey, can we improve? Like today, when you choose ASP.NET Core application in Visual Studio, you get another dialog, like the famed one ASP.NET dialog. There are multiple versions of that dialog. There's an ASP.NET Core version and an ASP.NET version of that dialog, and they're different. And then the .NET Core console app doesn't have that dialog. So if you want to build a .NET Core console app but choose the .NET Core version, you can't. So we would love to be able to take this chance to kind of build a one .NET template dialog, if that makes sense. And so I don't know what we're going to do. It's something I would really love us to chew off though, and really see if we can make the experience of building new applications with templates that have maybe slightly more granular options. That's the other complaints we get today, is that our templates don't have enough options. And so we put stuff in the template and some people don't agree with, like the cookie policy stuff. So we've already got an issue to put that behind an option. And so I'd like to invest a little bit more time in that in 3.0 as well. The last one is focusing on metrics and diagnostics. So this is about when you run your .NET Core applications, how do you get details about how those applications are running? And then how do you diagnose issues with those applications when something goes wrong? Now today, if you've come from .NET Framework on Windows, you have a whole sort of workflow available to you and a whole bunch of tools available to you, right? You know how to take a dump. You right mouse click in Task Manager, you get a proc dump, you run proc dump. You can take that file, you can analyze it in Visual Studio or in WinDBG or CLRMD, blah, 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 right? Or you can, there's a whole bunch of things available to you. You can use perf counters to look at what's happening in your application. It'll tell you about the thread pool. It'll tell you about memory allocation and requests per second. Or you can use ETW and message analyzer, or perfview or xperf collect, whatever it's called in the Windows SDK, to collect all the messages that are coming out of your .NET applications. And most of those things don't require you as the app developer to do anything. That's just part of running on Windows, right? You get it basically for free. Now that .NET Core is cross-plat, and even on Windows, not all that stuff works because it was part of the .NET Framework / Windows relationship. And so there's quite a big gap when it comes to basic things like, great, where are my perf counters? And, well, there aren't any in .NET Core. We have a new thing called event counters, but no one's emitting them yet. How do I collect those? You really don't, really. Or you use perfview, but perfview's only on Windows. And so there's a whole sort of gap there that we want to try and address. And there's a new thing coming in 2.2, we're called Event Pipe, and we will do a demo on this in a couple of weeks, because this is a really, really, really cool demo. We have a new feature in 2.2 that's on by default in every application. So every .NET Core 2.2 application has this, you have to do nothing. It basically allows us to build a set of tools, which we're doing right now, that for any .NET Core application, you'll be able to issue a command on that machine that tells that application to start dumping events. Okay, so think of it like ETW, but we've built it into .NET itself so that it runs on Linux, Mac, and on Windows. So you can say, hey, .NET Core process with this process ID, please start tracing events for events that have this category name and pass these flags to that event as well, please, for filtering or whatever. Or can you please take a dump of the process right now and just orchestrate whatever you have to do based on the current OS to make that work. Because taking a dump on Linux is different to taking a dump on Windows. Okay, you need different things. Turns out that we ship a few of these bits today with the runtime, but they're kind of hard to use, and you have to know where the docs are. They're in GitHub, they're not on the doc side. It's not a great experience. Then once you have like the trace session file, which will be a netperf file, or you have a dump file, what do you analyze it with? Well, if it's a Windows dump file, you can just use all the stuff you do today. But if it's a Linux dump file, like what do? Do you use LLDB, whatever that thing's called? The open debuggery tools? Or do you Do we want a different type of dump format, or would you like, do you have to bring it to Windows and use event purview, or do you have to use a different command line tool? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a consistent way that you could easily look for events, or say dump the heap, or use the SOS commands that a lot of people like using on Windows in WinDBG today to like look at threads and to dump stacks and to navigate the memory heaps to look at objects and stuff. Wouldn't it be great if you could just do that using a .NET Global tool, right? So those are the type of things that we're building right now. They're all facilitated by this runtime feature called the event pipe, and it is in 2.2 by default. Controlling the event pipe is based on a special magic file under the covers, which is an implementation detail in 2.2. But that is in there, and we're going to build these sidecar tools to kind of build up this ecosystem of how do we make it easier and sort of functional to do this type of metrics and diagnostics on .NET Core apps. And then the hope is that by 3.0, this would just be default. So you install the .NET Core SDK and you get these commands by default. And maybe if you don't want to install the SDK on your server, you can install just the commands that you need to get the dump command and the trace analyze command and the trace session command. To control all your .NET processes and get this information while the apps are running live. And so that's kind of the very bad version of the arc there. Like I said, we'll do a special show on this because the demos are actually super, super compelling. Include like, you got your app running, you can type a command at the command line, and then it starts dumping all the counters in the console, and you can see the counters update in real time, a little bit like Perfmon on Windows today. Or you type a command, and then now you've got like a pre-canned analyzer profile, so you can say, yeah, I've got an ASP.NET Core app, something's wrong with it, I don't really know what to look for, can you just start like a trace session that's designed for ASP.NET Core? We'd have one of those built in, and it'll capture all the events that we think as the product team are useful. If you need to diagnose issues in an ASP.NET Core app, you'll get a netperf file, and you'll be able to run it through a different command that says, can you find any problems in this netperf file, assuming it's an ASP.NET Core app? And then it could like detect thread starvation, or detect synchronous API calls when you should be doing async, or detect objects that have been allocated too much, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we will build up those things based on what we've seen customers do, and obviously we expect the community would hopefully build those analyzers as well. So yeah, that's kind of the dream, right? Is that you'd be able to bring in analyzers, bring in profiles, and all that type of stuff. But we need to do the bottom-up effort of even making the runtime support emitting these events, and so that's what we started in 2.2, and we'll continue in 3.0 as well.
Wow. That is a ton of stuff. There's some good questions, but it's after 4.
It's after 4. I really need to get going. So, I mean, I can probably do like 5 minutes.
Oh, gosh. All right. I was ready to just... okay, so...
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, question here. Let me see. Okay. Question. Can we have localization out of the box in default Visual Studio templates?
Oh, that'll nugget. Probably not in 3.0, no. Okay. Yeah, we just don't have the enough people assigned to templates in order to make that. It's not trivial, right? It's a fairly big deal. It's a lot of work. That would be a fantastic candidate, honestly, for the community to maintain. If someone wanted to champion owning a package that contains localized versions of all of our templates, then anyone could just install that from the command line, and then or via a v6 or via a v6 extension. I think that would be a fantastic one for them to maintain.
Yeah, especially with the NuGet package, like the Razor as NuGet package. Okay, question here. State of .NET Native and Monolinker?
The .NET Native as a name has kind of been abused a bit. .NET Native internally really refers to the technology UWP use. But the idea of an AOT.NET, a .NET that you can compile more ahead of time, and a linker that can take bits out of your app that aren't used, that's also something that we're looking at in the 3.0 timeframe. Obviously, it's not part of ASP.NET, it's part of .NET in general, but that is something that we want to make some progress on in 3.0. We're not going to get all the way there, but I think you probably will end up seeing something. I think in the build we talked about this as like the app bundler, like Scott talked about the idea of I can take my WPF on .NET Core 3, run it through the app bundler, and I get a really small single executable file. The plan, as I understand it right now, is we will do something along those lines in 3.0, more targeted at desktop apps, and then we hope to sort of expand that to more app types in the future.
Okay. Last question here from Christian asking about HTTP over QUIC, QUIC.
So that's obviously, the talk on that has kind of ramped up in recent days. Saurabh is the PM on my team who owns Kestrel and the networking stack, and he knows a lot more about that than I do. We won't do anything in 3.0 for that, is my understanding. Not anything tangible. There might be some small things we do, sort of implementation-wise, that sort of move us further forward. But I would need to get a longer-term plan from him on that. My understanding is at the moment they're debating whether that basically becomes HTTP 3. And because HTTP, it's not really HTTP 2 over quick, and it's different to HTTPS, and it's kind of its own thing. Like Chrome does it already today, right? Because YouTube uses it and Google uses it for its services, because it's all about reducing latency and time to first byte, and there's a negotiation of a session and session resumption and all these type of things that they really care about for getting stuff to be as quick as possible, delivering ads to your face as quick as they can. And for mobile as well, because mobile obviously is a huge part of the internet today, and it's very different to browsing on here. You want it to be as quick as possible. So I think you'll definitely see us do something. I'm probably not in the 3.0 timeframe.
Cool. All right, you should go.
All right, I am going to go. Thanks, everyone. Golnez has been down here playing with our audio the whole time, so we'll see if it's any better this time. She's shaking her head, so maybe not. But we will continue to work. We will continue to figure. Maybe this machine's just cursed. We will figure it out, and we will make this audio perfect one day. So thanks for bearing with us. Good to talk to you, John.
Yep.
Catch you later, everybody.